Hello everyone.
안녕하십니까.
It's time for
신약 결혼
introduction to the New
시간입니다.
Testament. At this time, we will study about the law. The law itself is a perfect law. However, this law, whether we humans who are men can keep this law or not keep this law, because people do not know about this precisely, there are many people, from the day that this law had entered this earth, many people tried to keep the law in order to become righteous before God. And many things had happened. However, there was not one person in this world who could keep the law. In the Bible, this is what it says. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. And that is what is written there in the book of Romans chapter 2. You hear the law and you understand the law. This is what the law says. And this is what the law says. And saying that, you may understand the law and you may be able to explain the law. But the reason God gave man the law, He gave it to us to keep. However, man, is he able to keep the law or not? Last time, we talked about what was wrong with man and about the nature of man's sin. And so it is not that there is something wrong with the flesh, but the heart that rules the flesh, the ideas of the heart that are not of God. From the day that this had ruled man's heart, humans had rejected God and refused God and only lived a life of going against God. And the reason for that is not because we wanted this, but the one that rules our hearts, the one that goes against God, through that spirit of Satan, the human beings could only be led this way, and that is what the Bible is clearly telling us. And so, just how much man could actually keep this perfect law of God, or not, through the Bible, we can both see these things. And so there was a clear will and plan of God when He had given us man the law. However, the people who received the law, they just stood in front of the law. All I have to do is serve God well, don't I? And with those kinds of thoughts and ideas, it leads their hearts into that, but what the law is, and what the law does, and what is of the law, they do not know that in detail. And through the Ten Commandments, they just memorize them. And the thoughts that all I have to do is just keep it, right? But those thoughts rule the people's hearts, and often they will challenge themselves to keep the law in that way. But once we search into the Bible, a man with this body of man will never, ever keep this law of God. And we can discover this. First of all, the law. What is the law? How was the law given to men? Through the Bible, we will first search into this. If you look at the words in Galatians chapter 3 verse 19, this law, it says in the word that it was added because of our transgressions. The law was added unto the ones who committed sins. Why? In order to expose those sins. And so the law, through the hands of angels, it was given down. And so the law should be there until the seed of the promised one should come. And that's what Galatians chapter 3 verse 19 is telling us. Therefore, the law, there was a clear point when that law came, and there's a clear point when the law ends. Until the seed of the promised one comes, there is the law. And so the law came, and what did the law do unto us? What does it do for us? The law only, just as these words say, was only added because of our transgressions. To the person who committed sin, hey you, that's a sin. Hey, that's wrong. In order to teach them this, what God had given us, the Bible tells us that He had given us the law. And so even before this law actually came, there was sin, but before the law, that sin was not revealed as sin, and it could not be acknowledged as sin. And so the law came, and the law condemned that sin, and then people realized, oh, I am a man who had broken the law. I have done wrong, and through the law, we came to know this. Therefore, by the law, it makes us realize sin, but the law itself, in order to keep us from sinning, in order to have us defeat sin, it is not able to give us this power, nor is it able to rid us of this sin. It's just that when we do something wrong, the law comes and tells us, hey, you did something wrong. Hey, you have committed sin, and this law condemns me. Although it may make me realize what is sin, but that law cannot keep me from falling into that sin. And it cannot protect me from being dragged by that sin. So then I, on my own, can I keep the law? Impossible. And just as we spoke about before, the heart of man had already been ruled by sin, which is not of God. Because of this, that is why surely Satan and sin, it does not allow us to obey God, but it makes us go against God, because it makes us rebel against God. As long as we have this kind of heart in us, we can never adhere to the requests of the law. What does the law do for us then? It condemns us. It gives us realization. And whenever we commit sin, it let us know that this is sin. But regarding the law, the Bible also tells us this. It has become a schoolmaster unto us. And so the law, as it locks us in, it then leads us before Jesus, has us meet Jesus, and through Jesus Christ, we get to meet salvation and God, and it leads us into that world, and that is the work that the law does. Therefore, let us search into the words of John chapter 8 and look at it in the Bible. And now I will read from John chapter 8, verse 5. And now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? If you look at the Bible, this one woman who was taken in the act of adultery, so the people of that time, the scribes, and also the Pharisees, and many people dragged this woman and brought her in front of Jesus. And the reason they looked for Jesus was not to bring this woman to Jesus, but with this wrongful sin that she committed, with that they wanted to tempt Jesus. And so what did they say to Jesus? This woman was taken in the very act of adultery. Now Moses and the law commanded that such a woman should be stoned. But what sayest thou, Jesus? And that's what they asked. Of course they may have thought this. If Jesus says, stone her, according to the law of Moses, they would have said, love. This Jesus who preaches about love, now he's just a fake prophet. And they were thinking to dump it on him like this inside of their hearts. On the other hand, if Jesus were to break or go against the law and say otherwise, then they would have said, oh, Jesus, he is breaking the law. And that's what they had thought. Now, like a rat in a trap, surely now we have him. We won. I don't know if it was with this heart that they spoke to Jesus, but the Lord did not give them the answer that they wanted. But this is what he said. He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And in these words, let us search into a few things. This woman who was taken in the act of adultery, what condemns this woman? The law of Moses that they were exerting. This law says that this sin of adultery of this woman should be stoned to death, and that judgment had been passed. And so, what brought this woman in front of Jesus? This woman did not come by herself. The people that brought this woman, on the surface, it was the scribes and Pharisees and the people of that time. But the law had these people drag this woman to Jesus. So in the Bible, this law, it makes you realize sin. And so what is the sin of this woman taken in the act of adultery? It's the sin of adultery. Perhaps if there was no law that said adultery is sin, then she didn't commit sin. But then this law said to this woman, you committed adultery. You are a sinner. Therefore, you must be stoned to death. And that law gave that judgment upon her. And so, the woman was brought in front of Jesus by those who exerted this law. In other words, the law became the schoolmaster. These words, they come out in Galatians chapter 3, verse 23. Let us briefly read these words. In verse 24, wherefore the law was our schoolmaster, to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. The law is our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ. And so then this law became our schoolmaster. And where does it lead us to? And so again, it leads us to go in front of Jesus Christ. And so then through believing in this Jesus, we are justified by faith. And so the law, although it does make us realize what sin is, and although it does condemn us, and although it does give us judgment, but this law, where does it also lead us to? It leads us to Jesus Christ. It works this way. And in order to lead us to Jesus Christ, so that we might be justified by faith, this is the work the law does. And so therefore, when we actually properly collide against the law and try to keep the law, the fact that I can never keep the law of God, all people will be able to discover this. Then you'll discover yourself that you are absolutely not able to keep the law. In order to keep that will to keep the law again, you will no longer belong to that will of trying to keep the law. And because there is no way for you to keep this law, you will search for another way. And so in the Bible it says, this law became our schoolmaster in order to bring us unto Christ. And the schoolmaster, what does a schoolmaster do? And speaking in today's terms, taking children from their homes and leads them to the kindergarten. A long time ago, the child would walk holding the mother's hand, or their uncle or their aunts would walk with them into their kindergarten, and then they would come home. But nowadays, the kindergartens, they have their own school buses, and inside of the school bus, there is a school teacher that is guiding the students. And so then the school bus would stop by in front of each of the children's homes and takes them to the kindergarten. And there they will go and learn language. And after it's all over, they would get back in the school bus and then go back home. And the one who guides them back to their parents, at times it's the driver of the school bus, or at other times it's the teacher or some worker who follows along in the bus. And so the one who does this is what we call the schoolmaster. A long time ago, because they didn't have such cars, they would have one young man would gather them. They would take the precious child from the family to go to the school, to be educated by the school under the teacher. And then the person who brought that child back home, that was the schoolmaster. And so this law, it precisely leads us to stand before Jesus, and it has us meet Jesus. And the work that the law does is that through this it makes us gain righteousness. But here, the Pharisees and the scribes, what do? In their hearts, although they came to tempt Jesus, but in reality, just like in these words, this woman who was taken in the act of adultery, this woman who was standing in front of the law of Moses, she had to be stoned to death. This woman had no way, she had no methods. She could only die, she could only be cursed, and she could only be judged. And from all the people who were there, she was spat on, she was mocked, and she was turned away. And she had only gone through pain, but this woman, where did they lead this woman to? They brought her in front of Jesus. And then they had this woman stand in front of Jesus. And through this incident, although they tried to tempt Jesus, but as they brought this woman in front of Jesus, as this woman and Jesus met, here in John chapter 8, as this woman who was taken in the act of adultery, through Jesus, she truly gained righteousness. And isn't there not the amazing work of her receiving salvation? And therefore, because this woman had committed sin, on her own, she cannot come before Jesus. Why? Because if she comes, then she needs to receive the judgment. But then this woman, the law had brought her forth and made her stand in front of Jesus. And then through that law, she was able to meet with Jesus. And through that Jesus, she was justified. In the same way, in today's time period, what is the one that leads us to God? It is not that I have to look for God on my own, but because of the will for me to believe in myself, and because of the heart to believe in myself. But when you go in front of God, you try very hard to live a good spiritual life or do something on your own. And ultimately, that does not get accomplished. Because of this, in the end, you discover that you cannot do it. And as you realize that this is impossible, you come to seek God. And as you do this, as you meet this God, and you get to receive the grace of becoming saved, today, the law that we talked about is teaching us this very fact. So this law, until when can it rule over us? The Bible tells us that it is until the promised one comes. And so let's read another word that comes out here in the book of Galatians. If you look at chapter 3, verse 19, wherefore, and serveth the law. It was added because of the transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by the angels in the hand of a mediator. If you look here, it says, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made. Until then, that's when the law is. And so the law, through Moses upon Mount Sinai, it entered into the world of man. But until when does this law rule over man? And until when will it reign over man? Just like in the words of the Bible, until the seed should come to whom the promise was made, until then is when the law will reign. But once the promised one actually does come, then the effectiveness of the law comes to an end, and therefore the law loses its strength. And so who is the seed of the promised one? This is teaching us that it is Jesus Christ. And therefore Jesus Christ, when He comes, the law comes to an end. And that is what the Bible tells us. If you enter into Luke chapter 16, verse 16, the law and the prophets were until John. And that's what the word says. And so the law and the prophets, they were until John. And the reason for that is, the law cannot rule over us. And if you also look at other words, if you look at Matthew chapter 11, verse 13, it says, for all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And this is what the word says. If so, then these words, when we study these words, it says that the one that ruled men until the promised one came, this was the law. So why does it rule over us? Because all people were locked under the law, and therefore through Jesus Christ, in order for us to be able to be justified, all people were locked under the law. There would be no one who would dare open his mouth and say, "Oh, I am a rightful person. Oh, I don't need Jesus." In order to have no one be able to say this, all people became sinners under the law. And that is why men are locked under the law. And so as they meet Jesus, in order to have all these people be justified, this is the work that the law does. Therefore the law, it rules over us until Jesus comes. And as Jesus came, and as the law came to an end, in our hearts, sin also comes to an end. And so this woman who was taken in the act of adultery, this law had ruled over this woman. Even though this woman wanted to run away, what was it that was holding on to this woman? Many people captured this woman on that scene, and therefore, "Oh, you're a terrible person. You are a sinner." And she was accused, and she was being dragged over by the law of Moses. This kind of woman should be stoned to death. With 2 or 3 witnesses, she should be stoned to death. And this woman, inside of the law, she became a sinner. And this law took this woman, and it brought her and condemned her, and she received the judgment. And although it was seeking her, but the moment that Jesus met this woman's sins came to an end. Of course, on the surface, Jesus, he was wearing the body of the flesh. And this woman, the two of them met. So if you go deep into the internal world, there are some things that we must look into between the conversation between Jesus and this woman. And the first thing that the scribes and Pharisees did was bring this woman in front of Jesus who was taken in the act of adultery, and said, the law of Moses says that she should be stoned to death, but what sayest thou? And when they asked this, Jesus wrote on the ground with his finger and said, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." And this is what he said. And so the many people who heard these words, until that moment they had brought stones in each of their hands. And so they brought these stones in order to stone this woman to death. And in their eyes, this woman had no way out. She has to be stoned to death. And that's what it clearly says in the law of Moses. But after hearing these words of Jesus, these people, they wanted to stone this woman. But until now, how the law of Moses allowed them to see this woman? "Oh, I am a person who can boldly stone this woman to death. Oh, this woman deserves to die." They had no problem with this at all. However, upon hearing the words of Jesus, the stones that were in their hands, as they wanted to throw this stone at the woman, but there was a problem. Why? "Let him that is without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her." The one without sin? So if they're going to find the person who is without sin, they have to reflect upon themselves in front of the Word. And even they themselves, when they reflected upon themselves in front of the Word, then just like this woman here today, although they didn't get caught in the act of adultery, in their hearts, they had sin. This woman committed adultery, and her sins were revealed. But although they did not commit adultery, but they had sin in their hearts. Oh, I have sin. Because they had sin in their heart. Even just a little while ago, they were boldly people who were going to stone her to death. According to what? According to the law, that's how they were. But then what did Jesus say to these people? "Let him who is without sin among you, let him be the first to cast a stone at her." They lived thinking and reflecting upon themselves as people who operate by the law, but then taking that law, they just reflected that law on the woman who was taken in the act of adultery. But because they never reflected it truly upon themselves, they never realized that they were sinners. And there are many people who understand the words of the Bible, and there are many who explain the words of the Bible. But in front of the words, they don't reflect upon their own hearts. That is why they don't know what they are doing wrong. When they look at this woman should surely be stoned to death. This is a terrible woman. Me? I'm an okay person. Although I believe that I'm a person who can execute this woman. And when they reflected upon themselves in front of the law, they also realized that they too had sinned. And therefore, from the eldest, they were pricked by their conscience, and one by one, they dropped their stones, and they all departed. And then Jesus said to this woman, "Woman, where are those thine accusers?" "There are none, Lord." Right then, what did he say to her? "Woman, neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more." And so, what freed this woman from her sins? It was the words that had come from the mouth of Jesus. It made this woman free from the law, free from death, and free from the curse. And it completely freed her and gave her this life of freedom. And you shall know the truth. And the truth shall make you free. That is what it says. What is the truth? It is Jesus Christ. When you properly and precisely know about Jesus, then even though you may be a person who did more sins, or did worse sins, or did more evil than this woman taken in the act of adultery, once you meet the precise word, just as the word made this woman free from all of her sin, and it made her no longer live as a sinner, and just as these words gave her the freedom to live a bold life, from your hearts, when you get to meet Jesus. Now this law, it leads us to Jesus Christ, and it makes us meet Jesus Christ. Now for 12 years, the woman who suffered from an issue of blood, for 12 years she sought physicians, and she tried so hard to get her sicknesses healed. For 12 years, this woman's sickness grew worse. She lost all of her wealth. And she had reached the point where there were no more physicians to come to, and that's how much despair she was actually inside of. She only experienced failure. Why did it fail? Because this woman's disease could not be fixed by physicians. Right then, this woman, she realized she could not heal this disease. And as she decided that the physicians of this world cannot heal my disease, at that time, whose voice did this woman begin to listen to? She listened to the rumors of Jesus Christ. As she listened to those words, "And now I will go to Jesus, and even if I just touch the hem of His garment, I will be healed." And that heart was made inside of her. And with that, she departed from the physicians and came to Jesus, and she met Jesus and touched the hem of His garment. And although many people were touching His garment, but the touch of this woman was different. And the power inside of Jesus entered this woman and healed her from her disease. And the issue of blood, it became dry and is healed. So here, through the law, when you discover that you cannot completely do it, secondly, you discover that the one you should meet is Jesus Christ. So where does this all lead you? It leads you to Jesus Christ. And therefore, it leads us until the point of meeting Jesus, and that's where it leads us and guides us. And that once you meet Jesus and once you gain that righteousness, the law comes to an end. And inside of this pitch darkness, when the light enters in, the darkness ends and the world of light begins. Likewise, from the world of your thoughts, when the word enters in, the thoughts end and a new world opens up in our hearts to have us meet Jesus. God, He gave us the law, and to have us realize our sin, and to lead us to Jesus Christ. That work is done by the law, and that's what it says. And through this, the woman taken in the act of adultery, she met Jesus, and from her sin, she became freed. And in the same way, during this time period, the Lord is leading us into that kind of a world. I'll speak to you up to this point. I will continue speaking next lecture. Thank you. We will end here.